Hello, this video is about the AnimToTexture plugin that was released with the city sample and is now rolled into Unreal Engine 5.1. Now with this plugin, you can take a skeletal mesh and bake the animation that is there for that skeletal mesh into some textures, and then use those textures to animate static meshes, which can be instanced, and you can make a crowd this way. So this video is about how to use that plugin. And maybe you found it because you were looking to, you knew about this plugin, you're looking on how to use it, and maybe you've even found this post here, which points at a video that I made about a year ago about a different tool set, the Vertex Animation tool set, which does the same thing. But that tool set does not actually compile anymore. If we look at it, we can even see the author points at this AnimToTexture plugin as an alternative way to do similar, basically the same thing. So I'm going to show you what I figured out about how to use this. This forum thread here says that it's not really clear on how this is meant to be used, but there was this clue here from a blog post that was in Japanese that I used Google Translate to decode, and it talks about the fundamental basics of this tool, and I use this together with this little bit of clues in this video, the Matrix Awakens Tech Talk video, which showed an editor utility widget that was used to make the digital assets that are needed to do this kind of animation. I didn't find this anywhere in the plugin. This wasn't included in the plugin, and so I set about trying to make something like this, and that's what I'm going to share with you. Now this tool that I've made, I'm going to make available. Anybody can download it from my GitHub. I'll put the link in the description. And it's just a couple of U assets, one to make a crowd and one which is the editor utility widget. And these are just U assets that are for Unreal Engine 5.1. Just put them in your project and it should work, and I'll demonstrate that. I'll demonstrate that now. So here's just a regular project that I started. It's got nothing in it. It's a basic empty project. I enabled the AnimToTexture plugin. You can just search AnimToTexture and then it will come up. Once you have that enabled, then you're good to go. I'm going to make a new level. Basic. We'll make some folders. And I'm going to put the AnimToTexture U assets that I just showed. So if you download this from Git, you'll get this in a zip file. You could just find your project and put it in the content folder. I'm going to put these in the blueprints area of that content folder, and you see they'll show up here now. We also need some character assets, something that we're going to animate. So I got a character here from Mixamo, and it's a zombie character called Romero. So I'll make a Romero folder to just be tidy. And we'll put Romero in it. Yep, and convert scene unit, and we're going to create materials. Great, I'm going to make another folder for motions. These motions that I have, these are all just motions in here, no mesh data at all. And they are all looping, different looping idle motions. So we'll put those in here. I want to make sure that we point it to the Romero skeleton. So now we've got our Romero assets and some motions. So if we look at the example, if you enable show engine content and show plugins, we can look at the plugin for this And there's some content examples here. If we go to characters, you could see that there's a working static mesh that is being animated by Vertex Textures. If we look at this material, they look animated and kind of crazy and broken. And the way that these are working is they're using an instance of this shader and some layer parameters. So this is using material layers to apply the animation, and we're going to do the same thing. So to make our shaders use the material layer system, we have to mimic what's happening here in this parent material. So looking at this, we have this area over here which is providing all of the look related information, and then this area over here is providing the vertex animation. We're getting the material attributes for the look, and we're mixing in this bone animation layer. And on here we have by default defined the material layer objects for vertex animation. We're just going to leave that. That comes up later on in this demo. So I'm going to copy this. And I'm going to close all this. And we're going to apply that to our materials. So we're going to go to the first material, and we're going to change this into use material attributes. So when you toggle this, it breaks the connections and makes this output thing that we want to keep. But in order to get these look informations, we need to make material attributes. We need one of these material attribute makers. And then we're going to plug in our textures, the normals, and this one's specular, and this one was plugged into metallic, but we're going to do a 1 minus and plug this instead into the roughness, because that makes a little more sense. And then between here and here, we're going to paste that layer related stuff. And I'm also going to make a switch. So instead of just plugging this in here, I'm going to make a switch to turn the layers on and off. So we get a static switch and a bool parameter. We'll call this use layers. So that'll be what controls whether we're going to just take it straight out of here. If we don't use layers, we want to go straight out of here. And if we do use layers, we're going to start incorporating this stuff. So that's the setup. So I'm going to hit save and copy that and paste it into this other material. So we have to do the same steps here. So we can do a 1 minus on this. And we can take this and turn it into material attributes, and we can make material attributes, base color, roughness, specular, normal. Put this down here and paste. Connect this to that, and then this to that. Save. Now at this point, we want to make material instances out of this. And now that we have that set up, we can look at our material instance, and we now see we have a layer tab with a material layer set. And all of these values are going to change when we run through our tool. But we need those things set up in order to change those values in the tool. So now we're ready to look at the tool. We'll go to Blueprints, and this Editor Utility widget. This is the first time I've really messed around with Editor Utility widgets in any kind of depth, and it was pretty fun. To run one of these, you right-click and you choose Run Editor Utility Widget, and then you get a window. And you'll get a floating window like this pop up. And you can dock it like this. And the way this tool works, there's 3 sections. One section with a group of buttons that we're going to execute from top to bottom. a section here where we're going to set some animations, and a section here where we're going to get new data assets populated as we click through these options. So it's set up to work either with a selection, so if you select a static mesh, it will work, or if you drag and drop your static mesh there, it will also work. We'll just leave the selection and click the first button to make a static mesh. What you'll see here is a new static mesh that it's created, and it's also populated these first two fields and this asset directory path. So it's made that in the same directory with that this is in. That's the default for all of these things, but if you want to change where all of these assets go, you can just change the path here and create folders. The next thing that we're going to do is create some new empty textures with this button click. And now you can see these have been populated with new textures. There's nothing in them. We need to do the same thing with this data asset. We're going to make a new data asset here. And if we click this, you can see there's a bunch of parameters here that are going to get set in the next step. But before we get to the next steps, we need to put our animations into this section here. So I'm going to make animations. I'm going to make enough slots for the number of animations that I have. I've got 12. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. So I've made 12 slots. And now I'm going to fill them up with these items. So I'm just going to drag these into the slots. So this is also another advantage this plugin has over the earlier plugin. That plugin was kind of coded to accept 5 animations. This one is pretty open-ended. You can put many more than 5. I've just put 12. So now that all this data is populated and all this data is populated, we can click the button to set the data parameters. This sets up the data asset. When we click it and look at the data asset, we can now see that we've got the skeletal mesh set here, the static mesh set here. We've also increased the size. We've set it to be the mode of bone animation, and we've set 16-bit precision, 3 textures, and 12 animation sequences listed here. So with all that data on the data asset, we can now hit the bake button, and we will get these textures will get populated with new information. We will also, I didn't hit the right one. Now we'll see these textures update. These 2 instances have been updated, and the skeletal mesh now has a new UV set here in channel 1 that is particular for reading these texture animation data from these textures. And if we look at these instances, we can see here that this was not updated because I forgot a step. I forgot an important step, which is to set these instances here. So these 2 instances need to go into these 2 slots. So now the instances are there. I'm going to hit the bake data again. And everything is now updated. And if we look at these instances, we can see that this has changed to ML bone animation. And our texture information, we can see when we turn this use layers toggle on, we can see our texture information is now here. There's also some other values that have been set here. But we don't see any motion yet, and we won't until we choose these toggles. Use Animate and use UV1. It's also helpful to use 4 influences. This is a useful option. So toggle all those on both of these material instances. I'll do the same over here. First, use layers. Animate, UV1, and optionally use for influences. Now I'll save this. And now our static mesh should be an animating mesh. Now it's at this point when I'll point out that you may notice I haven't figured everything out. One of the things that I haven't figured out is why this motion looks so steppy. You can kind of see it's kind of twitchy and steppy. There's an artifact that's happening that I could not solve. I tried for quite a while to figure this one out, and haven't got it. So if anybody out there can figure this one out and share what you find with me, I'd be really appreciative. I have some theories that I'll talk about at the end of the video, but I'm going to press on with how we can use this in an instancer. So this is just flipping through all of these motions, but what we would like is a field of these zombies, each with a different motion. So that's what the other blueprint is about. This is a blueprint that will make a crowd in a grid, and it takes two arguments. One of them is a static mesh, and the other is this data object. So the data object will tell it about the different animations that it has. And we can easily make this bigger, 30 by 30. And now you can see we have lots of zombies. And they've all got a different animation with a time offset. And if we think that they are too much in a grid, we can shuffle them around. And if we want to give them some rotation, you could do that. So now they're facing different directions. And zombies, as far as the eye can see. So that's the fundamentals. And if you find this useful, go out there to my GitHub and take these, try and make something out of it. And if you find it useful, please think about coming back here and giving me a like. It doesn't cost anything. Just hit that like button and maybe even subscribe. So from here, I'm going to talk a little bit about these individual blueprints and how those are set up. And I'll also mention some of my theories about why it's steppy. So I'll start with that. The steppiness could come from a number of different places. It could be the UVs. It could be the time, the way the frame is being calculated in the material. Or it could be something specific with the texture. I think the most likely candidate is the texture. If I look at this texture and compare it to what we see in the plugin, we'll go characters, mannequin, and then textures. We have a folder for the bone animation and a folder for the vertex animation. And looking in the bone animation, I'll open the transform, the position. And one of the things that I noticed that's different is this. The format here is listed as float RGBA, and down here we've got HDR 16-bit RGBA as our compression settings. And mine also has RGBA 16-bit as HDR as the compression settings, but mine lists the format at 8-bit. And I can't figure out why that is. Now I thought it might have been because I'm creating these textures, and maybe something to do with the asset creation that's happening in my blueprint is forcing it to be these 8-bit textures. So instead I copied these and overwrote these with the bake process. And what it does is it changes these floating point values, where it says float RGBA, into saying 8-bit, 3 channels of 8-bit information. So I'm not exactly sure why that says that, even though this is here. Here's another thing. If I change this here to some other format, let's say masks, you could see the format has changed. And if I go back, it's changed again back to float. When I do that over here, nothing changes. We'll do the same exact thing. sRGB, no change. Anything else, no change. So I don't know why that is. I did export this texture, and it looks like it's 16-bit. It writes out a 16-bit PNG, so I don't know if that's indicating something. But that's one anomaly that I've noticed, and that's where my theory is. So I don't know. Regardless, maybe even though it's steppy, it's still useful for a situation where you've got a field of zombies or something like that. Now I'm going to just show you a little bit about these blueprints. We'll start with this editor utility widget. It's a simple UI with a few buttons at the top. And this whole section is what they call a details view. And a details view allows you to display variables that are in the graph. So if you go over to the graph area, you can set up variables to be in these different categories. So I have a bunch of variables in an assets category and one variable in a motions category. And then over on the design tab on this object, you can tell it to display these categories right here. And that's how you get this kind of display. And then I'm using this to hold the variables as I punch through these buttons. Going back over here to the graph, each of these is one button. And at the top, we have a button to create a static mesh from a skeletal mesh. And it mostly uses this function, which comes from the AnimToTexture Plugin. This part here is a function that either gets the selected skeleton, gets selected assets and filter it for the skeletal mesh, use the first one, or if you don't have a selection, it uses the skeletal mesh that's already been set. If it's got a valid one already there, it uses it. If it doesn't, it uses the selected mesh. Going back here, the next button creates the textures, and it's doing that using the asset tools. So if you have one of these functions, you can get a whole set of editor-related asset tools, and one of them is a tool to create an asset. And we're creating a texture 2D class and storing that in a variable right here, which is this variable that you see here, this texture. We're also setting that 16-bit HDR compression type. We're also setting that here. We do that 3 times. We get the names for each of these textures here from a struct that's included in the plugin. And those are the names of our materials that we're going to use. So this struct is just being used to set a name. We do the same thing to create a data asset. All this is really just to get the asset path, and then we create that data type. AnimToTexture data asset, and then we store it in a variable, and we set some values, 16 bits, and I've increased the max size. Then here we set the parameters on that asset. This one's a little bit bigger. First thing we do is look for some animations, and if we don't find any, we print this message that you haven't set the animations. But if we do find animations, we're going to take, for each one of those animations that we find set on the UI, we're going to set the corresponding element in the data asset. So the data asset has this section, anim sequences section, and in there is an array of structs, and we want to set this element in the struct with the animation that we've set here. So for each of these, we want to set one of these, we want to add an element and set this part. That's what's happening in this section. So for each of those, we're going to insert that element into that. I'm also printing that to the screen as we do it. We are also going to set the skeletal mesh and the static mesh on that data asset. and then we're also going to set the textures that we've made on that data asset. Once all those things are set, you can then use the last button, which is to bake that data onto here, which is all happening in this very first section. After we bake it, we're going to update the materials. So for every material that is found on that static mesh, so for each of those materials, we're going to update the function. We're going to update the material layer here from the Vertex Animation one to the Bone one. We're going to switch from this one to this one. We're also going to set all of the attributes from the data asset that are needed on that layer thing. So that's happening here. And here is where I'm trying to set these two parameters. Use the first UV set and use use the animation. Set the animation toggle on. And that's everything that's happening in there. Now if we look back over here, there's a section here where I was going to make a button to do everything all in one go, but that turned out to be a little bit of a hassle. So next I'm going to show you the crowd blueprint. This one's pretty simple. It all happens here in the construction script. We get the static mesh that we've set as one of our variables here, the static mesh, and we set our instancer, this instance static mesh, to point to it. And then for every row that we have, so there's a variable rows and columns. For each of those rows and columns, it's going to set up a location, a new location for a new instance using the column distance, the row distance, the shuffle amount, and the max angle to make a transform. And then it's going to instance the static mesh at that transform. When all of that is done, it's then going to loop over all of the instances. Rows times columns will give you the maximum number of instances. And so for each of those, it's then going to set a bunch of custom data values. So custom data is how you can get each of these instances to play a different animation. And there are 5 custom data values that this material is looking for. So if we look at this material and we look at the layer, the material layer that this thing is using, this is where all of the animation is happening. And this section over here is looking for 5 custom data values per instance. And they each have an index, 0 through 4. And each of those is looking for one of these type of values. So the first 2 are frame offset and frame num frames. And if we go back over here, that's what we're setting here. Frame offset is index 0, num frames is index 1, and we're getting those values from the data asset. So here's the data asset variable that we plugged something into, and this function, which comes with the AnimToTexture toolkit, with the AnimToTexture plugin, this function will look at the data asset and find the index that you specify here, find one of those animations, and we're using this to get a random number from 0 to the number of items that we have in our list. So pick a random one of those and then get its little struct with the information in that struct, which is the start frame, the num frames, and these other values. And we use that randomly for each instance. We plug those data into each of these custom data fields. And that's how we get new motion on each one. This last one is the time offset, and we're just getting a random value here. And this last section is just to reset the struct to defaults before we go through the next loop. I needed to add this because I was getting some offsets. Something odd was happening without that. And that's pretty much everything there. There are these sections here at the top and bottom, and this is another place that I couldn't quite figure out. If we look here in the AnimToTexture section, we have these AnimToTexture playback functions. A bunch of functions here that I tried to use in place of my methodology here. So what it looks like is that we could potentially set all this up and then apply it in one go, but I could not get that to work. So it looks like this is the setup where you allocate some data for like a bundle of instance data, this data for all of the instances. You set it up in advance, you loop over your things or whatever you need to do to set that data, and then you apply it all in one hit. But like I said, I couldn't figure out how to noodle these together. And it was giving me some crashes when I tried to do what I thought was the way to do it. So I just kind of parked it and made this work. And hopefully this video is useful for somebody who's trying to get this same kind of thing done. Vertex Animation is very cool, very handy feature for especially if you're making, a crowd of zombies or something. That's it for now. Please give us a like and a follow. Thanks again.